This video is going to cover how children acquire language. And in order to understand language acquisition, we have to understand that both nature and nurture are working together. So the innateness theory of language, or the nurture explanation, has been popularized by Noam Chomsky, who argues that we have an innate or an inborn ability to learn vocabulary and grammar. Support for this is that we have structures in our brain that are programmed with fundamental rules of grammar. Now, Chomsky does not argue that we are programmed with a built-in specific language or with a specific set of grammatical rules, but that these structures in our brain that we've actually already learned about this year, called the language acquisition device, enable us to learn language. So I want you to think about which hemisphere specializes in language, what two parts of the cerebral cortex are involved in speech production and comprehension. Pause the video and see if you can recall that information. So hopefully you remember both Broca's and Wernicke's areas. Broca's areas enabling speech production. Remember, it's connection to the motor cortex, which allows us to move our lips and produce speech. And then Wernicke's area, which enables us to both comprehend speech and produce speech that is comprehensible. Aphasia, you may recall, or an inability to use language. There are two different types. Broca's, which is the inability to produce language. You remember Sarah, the young girl who's a stroke survivor, for whom language production is very effortful. And then we have also Wernicke's aphasia, which is an inability to comprehend or produce language that is comprehensible. And you may remember the older gentleman that we saw earlier in the year, also a stroke survivor, but who speaks in what we call a word salad. In other words, his speech is effortless, but it's jumbled, right? Nouns, verbs. He's not using grammar properly, and we're not able to discern what he's trying to say. Some really interesting research has shown that macaque monkeys have areas in their brain that are comparable to Broca and Wernicke's areas, but these regions are involved in producing and understanding facial expressions of other macaque monkeys or other monkeys in their species, as opposed to obviously producing speech in the way that we do. But again, similar structures in their brains that enable this type of production and comprehension of facial expressions. We know that for most individuals, the language centers of the brain are in the left hemisphere, from Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga's research with split brain patients that we discussed back in our bio unit. Also interesting to note, and the same research has shown that the same brain regions that handle sign language are also the ones that handle speaking. So there appears to be something about language that is completely universal, whether an individual is speaking language or using sign language. The same regions of the brain are being used. This is further support for Chomsky's idea of universal grammar, which is that we are all innately programmed to learn grammar rules and to utilize them, regardless of the language that we speak or whether or not we're even producing language verbally or manually with our hands. Support for this universal grammar theory is that across cultures, language learning follows a similar set of stages that we talk about in our next video. Stages also occur at similar ages. Deaf children develop language with similar sentence structure and also begin manually babbling, meaning babbling with their hands, at the same age that hearing babies begin vocally babbling. But even Chomsky agrees that nurture matters as well. Okay, so again, we're not born with a built-in specific language or with a specific set of grammatical rules. As children grow and learn grammar, they discern patterns in the language that they hear. Language is learned through conditioning, learned associations, imitation, reinforcement. In other words, adults will reinforce correct speech in children. Children will learn to associate sounds with objects and actions and events by imitating other people. So learning is absolutely critical here. Again, like the universality of language is in that, all language have nouns, verbs, modifiers, um, but language is acquired in a way that's so rapid that it can't all possibly be learned. There's an infinite number of sentences in any language that can't all be learned by imitation or through reinforcement. And another phenomenon that we see is something called over-regularization or overgeneralization, which happens with children as they are learning to use grammar. They'll make errors that they don't hear adults making. They will over-apply the rules of grammar, or they'll apply the rules of grammar too widely. So examples of this would be like when my daughter Elise says, like, I goed to my room, or when a child says Billy hitted me, or I braked the lamp. As they're starting to learn how grammatical rules work, they'll learn that when you make a verb past tense, typically you're going to add an ed onto the end of it. But there are some instances we know, because we've mastered the language, where that's not the case. But children will apply those rules of grammar too widely. And this is something that, again, shows that language, there are some issues with this notion that language isn't entirely learned, obviously, because children don't hear that modeled in adults, don't hear those types of errors modeled in adults.